You're listening to 99.1 WQRT LP, and welcome to Radio Free Book Club for April 2023. I'm Ken Honeywell. I'm a writer and reader from Indianapolis, and today we're talking about one of the most positively reviewed novels of 2022, Hernan Diaz's Trust. Trust is not just a book within a book. It's more like 4 books within a book, each one offering a different view of an early 20th century New York financier and his relationship with his wife. According to my admittedly cursory internet research, Trust landed on more Best of the Year lists last year than any other book, actually tied with Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow as landing on the most Best of the Year lists. And I know that at least 2 of our club members who are in the studio today really like that book. So we're going to find out if they like this one. I don't know if Barb read Tomorrow.
I did like it.
Yeah. So we'll see. We'll see if we agree with the critics across the board. So let's do some introductions. Traci.
Hi, I'm Traci Cumbay, writer, baker, and hiker.
Traci, what's your latest baking creation?
You know, I've been laying off the baking a little bit because my pants are tight.
All right. I've been there. Hi, Robin.
Hello. I'm Robin Beery, a writer and ponderer. And I was reflecting, I guess this will be clearer later, but the only thing anyone ever taught me about money was how to make change and maybe how interest worked. And I had to figure what I figured out since then by myself.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So we'll see how this landed with you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hi, Barb.
Hi, I'm Barb Shoup. I'm a writer, and I have a very dysfunctional relationship with money. So this was really,
I'm with you.
Don't get it. So this is very interesting to me.
Yeah, that may be something we all have in common in this room. I suspect we all have, a not super tight relationship with money. Well, thanks, Barb. And just before we dive in to Trust, just a reminder, this is not a book review or an interview with an author. You can find some really great podcast interviews with Hernan Diaz if you're interested, but this is not one of them. It's a book club. And Trust is kind of a literary mystery, so there would definitely be spoilers. So if you're planning to read Trust, this would be a good time to stop listening. You can find this and all the episodes of Radio Free Book Club on Mixcloud and Spotify and Apple and just about anywhere you stream podcasts. So please come back after you've read the book. Okay, let's talk about Trust. Anyone want to take a shot at what the book was about? Maybe a brief description of it? Anyone?
Well, I would just like to say that if I hadn't committed to doing this discussion, I probably would have stopped after about page 10.
Me too.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Very interesting.
I probably would have made it a little further, but I agree that especially the beginning of the book was a very challenging opening.
Yeah,
just from an
boring.
interest. Yeah, from an interest standpoint, it was draggy, and it did a weird impersonation of like what was supposed to be an actual novel, like within like a book within a book, a novel within a novel that didn't really seem like a novel to me.
It didn't seem like a complete novel anyway.
It seemed like a bad novel. I mean, the beginning of it, and it's really interesting to me. I truly would have stopped reading it, and I loved it in the end. But we're always told as writers that we have to be so careful about our beginnings, and he just took that risk, and it just to me it was kind of like it just and then and there was really no tension. Everything was told. Nothing was discovered by the reader, and but then at some point I just kept going, and I knew I was going to read it because I was going to talk about it, and I entered it. There's that moment where you enter it, and I was doing it.
Which comes about 40% into the book for me. Mm-hmm. And that first section I described, this is a twinge of hyperbole, but as a precocious middle schooler's essay.
Yes.
Because it just doesn't do the thing that's so pleasurable in a novel, where it like really dives into a moment and expands. Everything happens at the same pace and there's no dialogue and it's just telling you. And, you know, I might have sent a couple of frustrated texts to our host here while I was in that section.
Yeah, you almost dissed it on our last podcast together.
I believe, I don't know if it's on the Dust Jacket or maybe one of the reviews that I read prior to, you know, trying the book, which actually before you asked me to be here, I had picked it up. You know, I was intrigued by the premise as it was described. And the opening novel, I think, was described as something like Henry James.
James and Edith Wharton were the comparisons.
And I'm not a huge Henry James fan, but I went and looked at like Portrait of a Lady, and just to see like, wow, did Henry James like take this long to get past the exposition in his novel? And no, not nearly.
Right, and nor did Edith Wharton.
And the quality of the language was not
really. No one
there.
does. I mean, because like both of your points, like no one would want to read something like this in real life. And so later on in the novel, when we're meant to believe by Ida, the narrator of, to me, the most engaging part of the book, the third part, that, you know, this was some sort of eye-opening experience for her, like her baptism in like literary fiction, it's a little hard to like actually believe that.
So we've sort of dived right in here. Let's take one half step back and set the scene. So somebody tell me, what was the structure of the book and what do you think, you know, it was actually about? Traci, you want to take a run at that?
So it is a couple of different perspectives on a titan of finance, and then it is sort of a backstory of a woman constructing his story for him. Is that fair? I'm not super confident about that.
Yeah. Anyone else want to?
Well, you know, to me, I didn't know anything about the book at all when I started it. I didn't know it was going to do that. I didn't know it was going to take that turn at some point. Mm-hmm. And in the end, I mean, I think I stuck with it more out of my fascination as a writer with how the heck he was getting away with it. You know, and keeping me engaged, because I didn't really know where it was going either time. And I remember a couple of like moments in that second part when I started this. I was unsatisfied by where the first part ended. I thought, okay, well, this isn't the book. So then going to part two, I thought, well, this is the same story. You know, what's the deal?
Right. So
and that was weird. But then there was a moment when I noticed the notes, and it would say something like more about Wonderful Mother, or details about, you know, furnishing or whatever. And then I thought, wait a minute, this is a book in process. It's not a novel, and it was in first person. So yeah, and then it switched again, and then, you know, you start noticing the differences in the treatment of the wife, which was very interesting and manipulative, and more so in the second part, because you saw he was just making her into what he wanted her to be. Yeah. And that was what he wanted people to know about him and his life. So, yeah. And I didn't like him. So how did you keep reading when you don't like a character? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. The second part did start to like pique my interest from time to time, just in the odd way that those notes, as Barb said, would just sort of, it'd be like, okay, remember to put down more about this. And they were all the most interesting parts of what the narrative would presumably have become, right? So it's like he was writing the most boring parts of the story, and then fill in an interesting part later. So that in and of itself was very mysterious. And then in the third part, you do sort of find out, I think, via Ida, who knows Andrew Bevel, the author of who you assume is the author of the second part. This is getting complicated.
Right. Well, she's his ghostwriter, I guess is what you could call it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. She ghost wrote the book, the part that we just read, the abortive memoir that with all these parts left out. And so that's why these parts are left out, because he doesn't really know those things. and he ends up asking her to invent them, which is very fascinating. That part of it really, like, that's when I really got involved.
Yeah, there was the one scene where he repeats a story that was actually hers from her childhood, as if it had really been his. Mm-hmm. He had forgotten that wasn't really his story, which reminded me of Kramer selling all of his stories to Mr. Peterman on Seinfeld. So, just to be clear, the first part of this is a novel within a novel by Harold Vanner. The story of this financier and his wife. The second part is the real life guy Rusk from the first novel, the real life Andrew Bevel.
Which he would say was the true story.
Right. And it was, clear pretty early on that it was going to be some form of rebuttal to this novel that you had just read.
I mean, it wanted to be a rebuttal, but it really, to me, felt more like if there was any part of it that he wrote, it felt more like a retrospective, hey, look how I made all the right moves and never made a wrong move and became the great man that I am today.
Right. It was a great man book like, Grant's or, or Roosevelt's or any of those, characters of that era.
Right. Another, genre that does not typically, send audiences like clamoring to read it.
Really?
Well, although people do read a lot of them. As a former bookseller, I can tell you, people buy them. I don't know if they read them.
Well, they're like, celebrity memoirs, and how true are those? Somebody's idea of the truth.
Yeah. I always assumed with those books, just as a sidebar, that people buy them mostly because they think if they just buy them and own them, then the success will just osmose.
How did they do that?
into their life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tracy, what did you think when you saw that it was going to be? I mean, I think we all can say the first part was kind of boring. I mean, the story was kind of boring. Not very much interesting happened at all. And then we get to the second part and we see that it's going to be some version of that story again, right?
Mm-hmm. And then there's a little bit of a voyeur aspect into it because, I mean, we probably all have those drafts, right, where you're writing along and then more about domestic life.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is one.
Ask
one
Barb
of the notes
about
that comes
this.
in. Yeah, exactly. Right. And second sidebar, I never read book jackets. You mentioned you'd read it, and you said you didn't.
I did not.
I like to go in cold.
Yeah.
So when that first note popped up, I had a moment of, oh my God, copy editing error,
That's funny.
And then, then subsequently, a few pages later, there was another one. I was, oh, okay.
It seemed like a mistake to me, too, when I first read it. I had kind of forgotten that was my first response.
Yeah. So was Rusk in the Harold Vanner novel, was he interesting at all?
Not to me.
No, only his wife was.
And she was interesting. Mm-hmm. But so let's talk about Helen a little bit and Harold Vanner's novel and his portrayal of Helen. How close to Mildred do you think Helen actually was?
Ooh, that's interesting because she's almost an idealized version of Mildred. I mean, they're both such perfect characters in so many ways. Like, he's never struggled. Everything's come easily to him. He's, just having one success after another. And and then he's really extremely terrible at the end.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think I hadn't thought about this till right now, but I think that character in the alleged in the novel, the first part, suffers sort of from the same kind of thing that the second part does, which was it's a guy writing about a woman at a time when men really didn't have a clue about any of this stuff, and so she seems not so different to me in either one. It was kind of like the first guy just assumed that she would be like that because that's what women were supposed to be like. And then, of course, the other guy, she wasn't like that, but he wanted to make her like that. And so, in a weird way, they weren't that different. I mean, the first guy, Vanner, gave her a worse kind of end with all that, stuff at the sanatorium or whatever it was, sanitarium, and that was a
with
bad
like
end.
eczema, right?
Yeah, and then the shock therapy, and that was brutal. So what was that about for him? If he was doing that, because that was really going to make the real guy look bad.
Right. So at one point, Ida suggested that they were both trying to do the same thing, that both Bevel and Vanner were trying to do the same thing, and that was put her in her place. Mm. And for Bevel, that meant I have to basically erase her from my whole history because everyone will see what a fraud I am. For Bevel, it was like, it's really a better story if I give her this horrible disease that might be, have something to do with her crazy father and horrible physical suffering. It's just a better story.
Right. And he couldn't even have imagined probably the real thing. That to have created a woman like she was probably beyond the limits of his imagination.
Well, I mean, I think that's a question. Do you think he knew anything about her, financial acumen? There was nothing like that in his book.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that came up at all. I think it really was a secret.
So it was a secret from us until we got to see her journals.
Right.
Till the very last, by page count, like 7/8 of the way through the book.
And that section was really short, too.
Right.
And disjointed.
Yeah. So.
Well, it's the one thing I thought was pretty interesting was the difference between the way what's his name? The real guy. I can't think of his name right now. Bevel, thank you. His assumptions about money and how he thought about money and how Ada thought about money, and had been brought up to think money was filthy. And that was fascinating to me, her worldview coming from her father, who was involved in, the workers' protests and stuff like that. And of course, there's that great passage in there where he does what so many of these people do. I did it all myself.
Right. He's the great man.
Yeah, he's a great man. I had no help. I did it all myself. And of course, he was fabulously rich even before he got richer.
So, what did you think Bevel was trying to hide about Mildred?
She was smarter.
Or why he was trying to hide like her interest in modern music and authors and all of her good deeds. Why was he trying to really downplay all of that?
So maybe I misunderstood your question, because when you asked, did he know, I was thinking of Vanner.
I did ask about Vanner.
Okay. But Bevel, I think,
but why do you think
was
Bevel
outshined?
Well, why was he choosing to repress those parts of her? I mean, she would have been a fairly well-known person,
right,
in cultural and charitable circles, right. So it wouldn't seem like it would be that easy to erase her. Mm-hmm. But why was he so intent upon erasing her in that way?
I feel like it was just because she outshone him in every way. Because he talked a lot about how he didn't understand the music, and it was her passion, and I think it was just like, well, just get rid of it. I'm writing the history now. I'm the great man.
Yeah.
I also think. No, wait a minute, I lost it. Keep going. I'll hope to.
Well, maybe he was concerned too, like to your point, Tracy, that like anything that attracted people's attention to her as being exceptional in some way would be a trail that would lead to specifically the thing about her investment genius.
The truth.
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of truth about her that he wanted to suppress, but that was maybe the thing that was just most shameful to him.
That unmans him, for people to find out that. But, the other thing, what I had thought of and lost, and now here it is back again, is that you find out really at the end in her section that it was her sort of her guilt and shame that caused her to become the philanthropist that she became, and to feel like she really needed to give all that money away. It was a way of atoning. And of course, he just didn't even acknowledge. I mean, he was in complete denial about the fact that he had helped bring the whole thing down. And she got it. She understood, and she didn't like what she had done. So I don't know whether he, you don't really find out whether he knew that or whether they discussed that, but he wouldn't have wanted anybody else to know that either. And yeah, so I think that probably had something to do with it.
Yeah, it seems like one thing Vanner got right was she really was just looking for an independent life where she could, do the things she was interested in and not worry about anything else. And he was the same. I mean, that was when they were happiest, according to her.
Right.
Yeah, they were doing their own thing, and they both sort of realized that was going to be okay with the other one, and that they could be happy that way.
So do we trust Ida?
Not entirely. No. I mean, for one thing, she's very adept and very smart, and she has the capacity to sneak in some self-aggrandizing if she wants to, or some untruths. And, the moment that jumps out at me related to that is when she realizes instantly how she's being swindled and by whom. And I thought, like, did you really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, she does, feel she is complicit in this redoing somebody else's life. She realizes that at some point, and I think she feels bad about it, but she keeps on doing it.
Oh, yeah, I would too. I mean, she's coming out of really difficult economic circumstances herself and being plunked out of those right into the lap of luxury.
Well, yeah, not even the lap of luxury, but just the ability to not worry that, to not
she
worry
gets her
about
own apartment.
money. Yeah. And that's, that's worth a lot when you've, lived that kind of hand-to-mouth existence, and then all of a sudden you have this opportunity where you don't have to worry about those things. It would be really hard to walk away from that.
Yep. I wouldn't. If anyone would like to offer that opportunity
well, I would like to think I would, but maybe I wouldn't. I don't know whether I would or not. And I think maybe that's one of the things that, you can't help but think about when you're reading this book, that this vast difference between the way these super rich people live and these other people who are really struggling every which way just to survive. And you don't see any middle ground, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. You only see the fabulously wealthy and the person who really just doesn't have anything. So she doesn't see an option for a middle class life. Really, it's one or the other.
Yeah, it's the relationship with money throughout the book. I mean, obviously, it's a theme throughout the book, and what money can do. By the way, has anyone watched Succession? Succession is back,
yes.
and the new season started.
I have to watch
season
that.
4, not yet, but seasons 1 through 3.
Yeah, it's the first episode's really good. In any case, so Bevel tells her at one point, he says, "My job is about being right, always. And if I'm ever wrong, I must make use of all my means and resources to bend and align reality according to my mistake so that it ceases to be a mistake."
Yeah. Woo.
So
a lot of that going on now,
right.
I think.
I mean, that seems kind of true. Is there anything we can do about that?
Well, we haven't done too well so far.
Right.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, her communist propagandizing father has that speech about how money is a fiction, which is true.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very, very interesting running theme.
Yeah. That was where to me the book started raising some questions that were honestly, I mean, to be fair, like they were raised by the book, but they were maybe more interesting for me than some of the questions about the characters themselves, which I don't know if that's a problem in a novel or not.
Yeah.
I guess. It's a different kind of novel. Right?
In a literary novel, I think it is.
I mean, yeah, characters didn't seem to be, necessarily the point of this novel entirely. And one of the questions that line of the fathers raised for me was like, so yes, money is a fiction, but also per Andrew Bevel, fiction is a currency, right?
Mm-hmm,
If you control reality, then you can make money off of that. Like you can turn that into power and money and, all of the information that he had, that no one else had access to for that crucial period of time that she, as it happens, was able to turn into, really great investments. That's one form of that, but there are just so many other ways that plays out. And I do wonder if one of the reasons this book was so, people took to it so much is because of the year that we had in the stock market last year and just, worldwide financially, a lot of very sort of now silly seeming assumptions about what reality was and how low you could keep interest rates, for like 15 years, practically nothing without some sort of terrible consequences. And, all of a sudden that question's now, live again.
Yeah, I thought too about 2008 and all the, that whole thing about people being able to take out loans for way more than they should have been able to take out loans and ended up losing their houses. And, there's something really similar to that in that part where he talks about how
he blamed it on housewives.
Yeah, well, of course it's their fault. Everything is their fault. But how where was that section? And he talked about how the working class.
Yeah, well, they were able to invest. The thing was,
right.
People, working class, middle class people were able to get loans and buy on margin, so they were invested in the stock market.
Right, and they were able to buy stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
And yes, and have credit. And Bevel was not wrong when he blamed a lot of unprofessional investors as being one of the reasons the stock market crashed and the Federal Reserve and all that stuff. He's not entirely wrong about that. Now, he apparently made a fortune illegally short selling, but,
got to do what you got to do.
You got to do what you got to do.
Right. All those investors, they did invest poorly, but mostly because they were laboring under a lie, right?
Absolutely. It's hard to blame the investors, right?
They didn't know that everyone else, the people with all the money, had already decided to get out as soon as they all got in, right? So,
yeah.
Basically, it sounds like kind of a swindle.
Yeah. Basically, Mildred caused the Great Depression.
Way to go,
No wonder she went nuts.
So, do you think Bevel could really, let's pretend Bevel is real now. Could he really so thoroughly snuff out Vanner in the way that he apparently did? Apparently a lot of people read this novel, or was that not true? Was it just, maybe that's something we shouldn't trust, is maybe, 3 people who talked to Bevel had read the novel.
Right.
So it was easier to, it didn't seem like it was going to be a bestseller, but it was clearly, a story about him, right? And if there was public interest in Bevel, then maybe Rusk was an okay substitute.
Right. So if someone wrote a book about Elon Musk, but not really Elon Musk,
right?
I think it would get a lot of readership. No, I thought that was ridiculous. It wasn't in the card catalog.
Yeah.
But no, that seems a little extreme. Did he really have that much power? Does anyone really have that much power to make something disappear from the card catalog?
Right.
Well, yeah, we don't have them anymore.
Right.
So.
You can make the card catalog disappear.
Somebody did that.
Metaphorically,
that was a shame.
God.
I think Nicholson Baker has all of those.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I don't know. That was just a little out there. On the other hand, you just think about this whole, all these things that are happening now where, what was this, Trump is paying people to suppress stories. And, well, yeah, I think people getting canceled over all kinds of things. And it's not impossible.
Yeah.
Sadly, I don't.
I mean, I think this, like, as we have discussed, like this, maybe for him, those stakes were artificially high. Like, he cared perhaps more than he really should out of proportion.
Well, he was an egomaniac.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Like, it was all about
and
his
a control
ego.
freak.
But, like, when the stakes are high enough that people do have to control
Are you going to go
narrative.
into every bookshelf in the country and pull the novel?
First of all, like,
he's going to have to ruin the card catalog in every library.
In every house, As presumably this was a novel that was actually for sale.
Yeah,
it could have been
true.
on my bookshelf.
There'd be a really
right
fun,
next to Blood Meridian. You could take that both.
There'd be a really fun novel just in following around his henchmen on their quest to eliminate every
what
single
happens.
copy.
Gosh, yes. I want you to write that now.
All right,
But
some speculative fiction.
This is just interesting because usually when you talk about a book, you're talking about the characters. You're talking about what happened, to people, and we're not really doing that.
No, we're not. And in a so-called literary novel, right? It's very unusual. So why do you think this book was so lauded?
I don't have any idea. I don't know.
Well, the way books are chosen for that kind of attention remains a mystery to me. It really does, because I've been watching this stuff for a long time, and what is it? I have no idea what it is. I think sometimes it's just who you know, and timing sometimes.
I can see this being a timing thing.
Timing in all kinds of ways. I always remember the story of the book called That Night by Alice McDermott. And that book ended up on the front page of the New York Times Book Review just because there was nothing else that week. It was like a week in summer. And it was a wonderful book. But it never, she said it would never have ended up there. It was just a fluke, and she was really lucky. I don't think that's the case with this book. But, I also think, sometimes I think that we all read like maniacs. We're reading all kinds of stuff all the time. But most people aren't like that. And so they're going to choose the books that kind of raise, and so it's possible that that's the kind of thing that happens. That the books and that book got a lot of promotion, and so it was in the public eye.
And then, honestly, I think people are followers. So one person makes a top 10 list, and then somebody else is like, maybe I need to put that on there.
Did I miss something?
Yeah.
Yeah. Although, so the New York Times only picks 5 fiction books for their end of year list, and this was one of them, which is why I picked it up in the first place. And I am that's what I find most shocking. Like, if it's on, the top 100, maybe. But top 5 felt a little like, what am I missing?
It was on like I saw a compilation. It was on something like 14 top 10 lists.
Yeah. But 14 top 10 lists. Well, so I guess, I don't want to give the impression, for me personally, that I didn't find this book well written in the sense that, like, the prose was strong. It didn't, despite the fact that some of the subject matter was, not as interesting as I would have hoped for the first half of the book. Like the sentences, I didn't get bogged down in the sentences. They were, pleasant to read.
But not so much in the first part, though.
Yeah.
It was sort of like it's one of those assignments where you say you have to write something that's not really good, but it suits a particular kind of voice or whatever.
Right.
And I'm just feeling really funny because at first I didn't like it, and then I got into it, and then I felt like I really liked it, but now I'm thinking, why did I like it? And I think that I liked it because I got fascinated by how it was put together.
Yeah. Right.
And that was what kept me going with that book. I didn't really care about any of the characters because they didn't seem real to me. Ida did probably. Well, the two women did more so. And I guess I sort of felt more like I knew the wife better, even though there was so little of her, so little of her real thing. But we were bouncing off what we thought we knew from these small nuggets that we could be pretty sure. I mean, she was dying. She didn't have anything to lose by not telling the truth. And that was, I don't know.
So go ahead. No, you go.
You read these books twice. I'm curious what it was like to read this a second time.
Well,
How did it wash over you?
It was not as good the second time. I think the structure of it was, like, as you just said, what kept me interested in it. I think the first book is just not that interesting. The second book is a rehash of the same story, but clearly something is going on there because it's notes to a writer. The story doesn't really get going to the third part, which is almost exactly halfway through the book. So, you've already had a couple of different versions of a not very interesting story.
Here's one more.
Right, before you get going. But, I do think, it was a surprise to me in Mildred's journals that she was the brains behind his finances. I don't know that there was a particularly good clue of that earlier in the book. I was pretty careful the second reading. She obviously had a lot of money to give charities, but even in Vanner's book, she didn't have a brain for finance.
Right.
Yeah. There was, it did, to me, the third book did sort of illuminate a curious scene in the first novel, the first fake book, where they go into his, study or whatever it is, and they're sort of looking at the ticker tape machine. And then there's all of this sort of like significance invested in their standing there and I think just kind of looking at it. And
he's telling her she can never go into that room.
Right, yes, exactly. That of course, that does raise all sorts of Bluebeard, questions and associations. But yeah, and then it just kind of the story just goes on from there, and that doesn't seem to address that oddness at all. And so I could look back at that and say, but I don't know. Honestly, that wasn't the most significant or fun part of the third book for me.
Finding that out, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. It was, Ida's story was great just because her voice was great and because she was now helping us understand all the homework, I guess, that we had done to get to that point.
It was also fun to watch her sort of manipulate Bevel.
And there were some interesting red herrings in that as well. The fact that all the women he was talking to looked the same. Did she look like Mildred in some way?
Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. A couple of things like that. This was one of my favorite passages here, which is, again, I'm talking about a passage of writing, but, she went back. Obviously, she's now had a successful career as a writer. The New Yorker had asked her to do a piece on this. Well, so she's going back to Bevel's house, which is now a museum. And she walks into the gift shop. And she says, "The gift shop I find particularly offensive. Irrationally, I am even bothered by the young man behind the counter. I peer in, wanting for unknown reasons to fan my outrage. Some ridiculous Prohibition-era tune is playing softly in the background. There is a profusion of pens, mugs, and postcards adorned with reproductions of objects from the collection and the museum's logo. The sidewall is dedicated to roaring 20s tchotchkes, boater hats, feather boas, hip flasks, satin gloves, cigarette holders, flapper costumes. Next to this section stands a gondola devoted to Francis Scott Fitzgerald, copies of all his books, biographies and critical studies, The Great Gatsby in different languages. Of course, not a single copy of Harold Vanner's Bonds." I've been in that museum.
Yeah, right?
Exactly. Okay, here's another weird thing. one of the the pleasures of reading a good book is that you are surprised by the characters, and there were no surprises really. I mean, the surprise of that she was the genius behind it. I didn't have that oh my God sort of feeling about it, but there are no surprises in the characters. The surprises are in the structure,
Right.
Yeah.
Which feels a little cheap.
well, distant,
Yeah, kind of like a trick.
yeah, a little bit like a trick. And I would love to know. I'm always fascinated by when people do something. He broke all the rules, that's for sure, and he got away with it with a lot of people because it's done so well. But how did he get to that? Was that what he originally imagined he was going to do with this, or did he come to it out of some desperation of trying to do something that he couldn't make it work, and then he did this? Because that's a lot of the time, I think, where these really unusual kinds of structures come from. Like, damn, I can't get it right. Oh, I could try that.
Yeah. Well, it worked in terms of sales, I'm sure.
Yeah, it did.
So in the end, what do we think of Mildred? Like her?
She's pretty fascinating. To say that I liked her would be a stretch. I liked her as a character.
Yeah.
I liked her. I felt like she was a woman of her time in the sense that she was a whole lot smarter than anyone was ever willing to give her credit for. And she, for better or worse, she did find a way to exercise that intelligence. And she took control of some parts of her life, which had to do with the things that she wanted to give money to, and he didn't seem to be too excited about those. And then later he didn't want to give money to anybody that was sort of exciting or new, or he wanted to stick with the ones that wouldn't be questioned. And she was really she really loved music, and she knew a lot about music, and I did. I mean, I felt sympathy for her because I felt like she was really trapped in this marriage, and she couldn't have been happy because she was too smart.
Yeah.
I did. I liked the version of her that we learned from her her diaries or her notes. After the first couple sections, sort of trying to like pigeonhole her and sanitize her into this version of this early 20th century wife of means, and then Ida's section, I feel like I don't think Ida like idealized her, but I think the mere fact of her understanding that Bevel was trying to erase her made her very sympathetic toward Mildred, and we never get Ida's reaction to what she actually learns about Mildred, right?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Well, she does figure out the journals, but we don't get specifics. You're right. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
And so, I think when we finally read Mildred's journals, like, yes, her like intelligence and like knowledge about music and her passion for it is obviously there. And I mean, I think you get the other dimensions of her too, that like her human dimensions, like she's a little bit of a snob about some of that stuff too, I think, in a way that's very human. And, makes her
and
feel
she's
like
anything but passive.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And she ends up feeling like the realist version of herself in those, which I guess makes sense. Which again, Barb, as you say, is not really much of a surprise.
Right.
At the end of the novel that she's a real person.
Yeah. So what did we get? I didn't get any insight into the human condition, which I expect to get from a literary novel. I learned a few things about banking, but I didn't really care about them. And I could have learned those Googling. I don't know.
So I have a I have another question about an idea in the book, not about any character. So Ida says at one point about Vanner's book, she says, "I had never experienced anything like that language, and it spoke to me. It was my first time reading something that existed in a vague space between the intellectual and the emotional. Since that moment, I have identified that ambiguous territory as the exclusive domain of literature."
Has she never heard music? Has she never seen art? I don't understand that at all.
Yeah. Anyone have any comment on that?
Well, she was setting the bar pretty low.
Exactly. I was like, I hope someday she finds her way to like Virginia Woolf.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Yeah.
But she's telling this story from like 1980s or something. So you would hope that if she had gotten there, she would not have made that statement.
Yeah.
Or she would, I don't know.
It was just the first work that spoke to her, kind of like the Hardy Boys for me.
Yeah. Well, when you think about that, though, I get that, that it doesn't have to be a great book. That moment where you, I don't know, there's just something about that moment, the first time you are in a book or something. But yeah, that wouldn't be what I thought would be the great literary moment.
No.
She was also going to have to retell the story, though, too. Mm-hmm. I mean, she hadn't started that writing process yet, that interview process, but she was right on the cusp of it.
Yeah, and she was coming from nowhere. She wouldn't have had much experience probably in just reading generally or life for that matter.
Yeah. It was, speaking of how reliable she is, it was kind of hard to believe her dad was this kind of like rogue typesetter, but who also couldn't spell, apparently. And he was like super meticulous about setting type, but he couldn't spell.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure I bought everything she said after that.
Well, it's also if you can think about the two women characters and the ways that they what they might have had in common and what they absolutely didn't, and the person who had the advantage in terms of the way of life and the money and whatever, she was less able to grab a hold of her life than the person who was coming from nowhere. Mm-hmm. So those restrictions of society at that time were, they were in some ways weirdly worse for wealthy women than they might have been for other women.
Imagine if those two could have teamed up.
They could have done
havoc. They could have wreaked.
I'd like to think about. There's a novel.
No kidding. So, trust. Did the book earn its title?
Well, there are who can you trust? The definition of the money in trust, and I don't know. What do you think?
There was a lot of trust. There were a lot of factors in trust going on, but even, more than any conventional, again, like literary novel, where there are always issues of trust. That's a lot of what a novel's going to revolve around, right?
I wouldn't trust Hernan Diaz with more of my time.
Well, that's a good segue into whether we would recommend the book or not.
Well, I might have before we talked about it.
It's funny how that happens.
Yeah, it is funny how that happens, but I'm not sure I would now, except I might say to another writer, it's very interesting how that book is put together. And you might read it for that reason, but the story itself is not very compelling, or it wasn't to me.
Yeah, if you are into characters, I would not attempt this book.
Or plot.
Or plot.
We're good.
But if you've listened to this conversation and you're wondering what the heck we're talking about, like I said, I feel like the prose is good even when the writing isn't. So, it won't offend your literary ear.
Yeah, Traci, you're gonna stick with that.
Yeah, that's a no for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I have kind of mixed feelings about it. I mean, I had a much better time the first time through, as I said, than I did the second time through. I don't think talking about it made it better for me, or thinking about it made it better for me. I think it's, an interesting puzzle book. I mean, if that's what you're into, then cool.
This is never what I read for. This is somebody playing around and going, look how clever I am.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, there's some of that for sure.
Yeah, but yeah, that's the weird thing about this book, right? Because he is playing around, but he's playing around with like the boringest blocks.
He really is, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
He wasn't clever enough to find the interesting parts. Sorry.
Well, and it's, he is playing around, but, so is Elizabeth Egan playing around. But she's playing around with a lot more interesting things and with actual interesting characters.
I don't really like her either.
Yeah.
Because I just find that stuff to be so fragmented. I think you're right. The characters are interesting, but
wait, who are you talking about?
Jennifer Egan.
Oh,
the
you
Candy
said Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Got
Jennifer Egan. Yeah.
I guess I don't like cleverness as a reader.
Okay, hang on.
Okay.
I'm not gonna let this maligning of Jennifer Egan go unmet.
Okay.
The thing about Jennifer Egan that so impresses me is, yes, she's playing around and she's being clever, but there is so much humanity in every single moment of it.
Oh,
and
I totally agree, Tracy.
Yeah.
You don't have to talk me into that at all. No,
Okay.
as much as I would want to ding, the Candy House after A Visit from the Goon Squad, which I thought was brilliant. The Candy House, I almost wanted to not like as well, and I probably liked it more.
What a trick, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, my problem is I don't see where the dots connect. They just seem very fragmented to me. And I, in both of those books, I engaged with that first part and I was really excited about it. And then it was gone. And those books are marketed as novels, but they're not novels. It's not a sustained, they just go all over the place and then they're over. And where are you?
Yeah, I kind of do agree with you that marketing those linked stories as novels is more of a marketing ploy in my mind than the good description of what the actual art form. Although I do think Jennifer Egan does make a lot of thematic links that I think you could argue that it's as much of a novel as this is, I guess, in that these parts were not really linked and the author didn't do any of that work for us. But it's still.
But they were all the same people. I mean, it was, it was
all people, who knew each other or knew of each other or were connected in some way.
Don't get me wrong. I think she's a wonderful writer. I think she's a wonderful writer. But I don't know. Those novels just leave me unsatisfied, I guess. I don't have any sense of closure with them.
Well, we're close to running out of time here, so let's talk about novels that might leave someone satisfied or other books that might leave someone satisfied. Tracy, you have any recommendations for us?
Listen, you're gonna love this, Barb.
Okay.
I'm reading a novel. It's got characters. It just goes straight through so far. There's a mystery. I'm late to the party, and actually Robin mentioned The Secret History by Donna Tartt, so I'm finally reading that, and it's a humdinger.
It is a humdinger for sure.
This book reminded me a lot in its structure and playfulness, not in any of the other aspects that we've talked about, of the novel that Nabokov wrote after Lolita, which was Pale Fire. And it's a very interesting, the analogy, I guess, here is that it's like 4 different sort of literary pieces that are related to each other, but that you have to make the connections between them. But it is like, if this movie is like an episode of Louis Rukeyser, that book is the Marx Brothers of this kind of book.
Yeah. And what is that, Robin?
Pale Fire.
Oh, Pale Fire.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I haven't read Pale Fire. It's one of those that I always feel like I should have read and probably should read and just haven't yet. But yeah, great recommendation. I should tell you that I read Dinosaurs after your last recommendation. Yeah, really enjoyed it. Yeah, Lydia Millett.
Yeah. Dan Barden told me I think she's coming to Butler.
Oh, awesome.
Soon.
Oh,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. This year.
Well,
Good to know.
check it out. Yeah. Barb, what do you got?
Well, I'm going to give you a funny, sad, poignant, amazingly well-written book that's called Miss Benson's Beetle by a writer named Rachel Joyce. She's British, and it is, I wouldn't even begin to know where to describe it, how to describe it. But if you've read Barbara Pym, it's Barbara Pym-ish, but the level of detail in this book is, to me, a marvel. I just kept reading passages over and over. It's a wonderful book.
Yeah, awesome. Tell us the name of that again.
Miss Benson's Beetle.
Awesome.
And if you like to listen, it's a great one to listen to.
Yeah, great
Yeah.
recommendation. So my recommendation, it's a book I first read several years ago. It's another book that features a book within a book. And I didn't really think too much of it when the first time I read it. It's Joshua Ferris's Then We Came to the End. That was one of the New York Times' 5 best novels of 2007. It's set in a Chicago ad agency, and it's written in first-person plural. So it's a we. Then I guess the protagonist is the collective voice of the office. And it is really funny, and obviously it was really funny the first time I read it. But on the second read a couple of years ago, I realized just what a beautiful commentary it is on how groups of people who work together have this collective personality, and how when someone leaves, the personality changes, and how we are really all fictions in each other's lives. It's just a beautiful book. I just can't recommend it highly enough. It's Joshua Ferris's Then We Came to the End. So speaking of the end, that's the end of this episode. You can find notes for this and all of our shows in the Radio Free Book Club blog on medium.com. You can also follow us and drop us a note on Facebook and stream the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Our show is produced by the brilliant and talented Oreo Jones for 99.1 WQRT LP in Indianapolis. For Traci Cumbay, Robin Beery, Barb Shoup, and all the members of Radio Free Book Club, I'm Ken Honeywell. Thanks for listening. And join us next month when we'll be discussing Walter Mosley's new book featuring Joe King Oliver, Every Man a King. Until then, read a book.